Today, in this video, I want to share with you the worst mistake you can make when talking about giving in your church. Now, you might be wondering, what do I know about this topic? Well, the first product that my business ever offered to the church world was called Pro Video Announcements. And through this service, we would essentially present and produce video announcements for churches on a weekly basis all around the world, based on the scripts that they would write and then send to us. At its peak, we were working with more than 100 churches and producing that many sets of video announcements every single week. Now, this isn't a service that we heavily emphasize anymore, but we still do work with a small handful of churches weekly, meaning for close to 10 years, I have been presenting church announcements, so I've seen up close the good and the bad. And if there is one mistake that aggravates me the most when talking about church giving, it's what I'm about to share with you in this video. So let's dive in. Well, hey there, I'm Brady Shearer. This is Pro Church Tools, and we're here to help your church navigate the biggest communication shift in 500 years. If we're just meeting for the first time, consider subscribing. We'd love to have you join the tribe here. Now, it's important to first acknowledge how difficult it is to talk about giving in church and do it well. This is a delicate topic, which is why it's so infrequently handled poorly. To that end, I don't just want to talk about the big mistake to avoid in this video, but I also want to give you my best tips for doing this well. Essentially, I don't just want to critique, I also want to advise, but, let's first start with the critiquing. Oh, and one more disclaimer. Like virtually everything in life, there are always exceptions. So if at some point in this video you think to yourself, well, actually, there was this one time where it did make sense for us to do this for X, Y, and Z, that's fine. Exceptions always exist. Habitually doing this thing is the greater problem, or perhaps even worse, not understanding why it should be avoided and doing it anyway. All right, the biggest mistake, misrepresenting where funds are allocated. Exciting, right? Now let's be clear. There are perhaps worse mistakes that you can make, the kinds where when you see them, you think to yourself, oh yeah, definitely don't do that. I know churches that have done that. I never would. I'm talking about weaponizing the Bible and using theological intimidation to compel giving. Don't do that. I'm talking about making implicit or explicit associations between giving to your church and expected future financial gain for the person that gives. Don't do that. Most of us are clear on avoiding those types of, ickiness when talking about giving. This mistake, however, is more insidious. It's harmful, but not really in an obvious way, which means more of us are more likely to do it and do it a lot, which is why, to me, it's more dangerous than those other, more obvious mistakes you can make. So here's how it goes. I'm gonna share with you an announcement script that I wrote. Think of this as an amalgamation of every version of this mistake I've seen in church announcements over the years, all right? Here we go. Hey, when you give here at Faith Church, you're supporting the amazing, life-changing work that we're doing in our community and around the world. Your giving goes to support missionaries both locally and globally, as well as other crucial ministries we support, like the food bank and women's shelter right here in our city. So thanks again for your generosity. Okay, did you see the problem there? Now, again, talking about giving is so difficult, and because of this, what many of us often do is we end up highlighting the line items in the church budget that we deem valid, or at least we assume givers will perceive as valid. And then we use those line items as the focus of our calls to generosity. The problem is that if you've worked internally for a church, we all know that these particular line items of missions, local benevolence, etc., almost always make up a very small sliver of the church budget, commonly 10% or less. And look, it's not that you can never talk about these ministries when discussing giving, but time and time again, I see churches using these ministries as the backbone for their call to giving, week after week after week. So I gotta ask, what's the internal motivation there? Let's explore that a bit. Perhaps it could be all about effectiveness. You might believe that your church will be more motivated to give if they feel their giving is tied directly to a ministry that looks like the hands and feet of Jesus, right? Like, who wants to give when the majority of the budget goes to covering salaries and facility costs? The problem with this line of belief is that it basically becomes self-fulfilling. Now, here's what I mean by that. If you disproportionately highlight missions and benevolence when talking about giving, you're implicitly communicating to your church that those are the items worth giving to, because that's what you're talking about most. But then that problem gets amplified when you know that just about 10% of the budget actually goes to those things, In a way, you're indicting your own budget. And this is how, politicians talk, right? This is all spin. And believe it or not, it actually gets worse, because when you're talking about local ministries or missionaries that the church is supporting, you're talking more often than not about independent organizations and individuals connected to the church, yes, supported by the church, yes, but not your church. So if the motivation to give to the church is to support those endeavors, well, why don't we just bypass the middleman altogether, the church, and give directly to those independent groups? Now, you might think I'm nitpicking with stuff like this, right? But we need to acknowledge that there's a stigma that comes with churches and giving. And to me, when you misrepresent where tithes and gifts are being designated, by talking about church giving in this way, you play right into the stigma and you risk losing trust from people in your church, which is, of course, ironic, because my belief is that most people talk about giving in this way. They make this big mistake. Why? Because they don't want the church to appear selfish, and they don't like asking for money. It's a little uncomfortable saying, yeah, we need your giving to cover our utility bills and salaries so, my family and I can eat and we can pay our own mortgage. That's not something especially enjoyable. But by overemphasizing these other ministries we support, these slivers of the church budget, we actually make the problem worse even as we try to avoid it. Because here's the other side of this coin. Paying the electricity bill matters. Running payroll matters. The mortgage, the rent bills matter. And we know these things matter in church because they are the biggest expenses in most of our ministries. So how do we talk about these things better? Well, first, be mindful of how you represent your church's expenses when talking publicly about giving. And then, if when you talk about giving, you do mention what people's donations go to, make sure you highlight the not so glamorous stuff sometimes, like the mortgage or rent, salaries, utilities. Now let's be clear, I'm not suggesting you need to use the water bill as the foundation for your calls to giving, but here is the verbiage I'd recommend. You can say things like, your giving goes to support the everyday essentials of our church, or your giving supports the day-to-day needs of our church, or, from a different angle, you could say, the everyday work of this church is made possible by your giving. Basically, what I like to establish when talking about giving is that everyday work. That everyday work of the church is what matters first and what matters most. And I know the church leadership believes it matters first and most because I can see it in the church budget. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also, right? When we talk about personal finance in our churches, you'll frequently hear leaders say, show me your checkbook and I'll tell you your values, or something similar. Checkbooks aren't a thing anymore. Well, if that applies to the individuals in our churches and their budgets, it must certainly also apply to our organizations, our churches, and our budgets. And let's not devalue the everyday work of your church either. Look, we love supporting missions and other local ministries beyond our churches, but those are independent organizations and individuals often. Our church is doing amazing things every single day, and the everyday work of our church is worth giving to. So establish that when talking about giving. You can then share a specific instance of life change in your church using story if you really want to upgrade how to talk about giving, and now you're in a great place. Look, essentially none of us that serve in churches have formal training in communications. I don't. I've picked this up through presenting tens of thousands of announcements that churches have sent me over the last decade. I've synthesized all that I've seen, the good and the bad, and then that informs how and what I teach about church communications. So, don't beat yourself up if you've fallen prey to this kind of mistake before. Just try to investigate your motivations. And don't undervalue the everyday work of your church because it really does matter. And it's worth supporting. Now, like I said, talking about giving is difficult, and that's often because when you talk about people's money, things can get, emotional. But if there's one thing that's completely unemotional about church giving, it's the fees that churches end up paying. Now, we've seen online giving explode since the beginning of the pandemic, and digital giving to churches is only going to increase in the future. And basically, you're going to receive fewer and fewer cash gifts and checks, and more of your giving will be received digitally. And for so many reasons, this is a good thing. The giant problem, though, is processing fees. Now, processing fees are unavoidable to a certain degree with digital transactions of all kinds, not just with churches. But one thing I quickly learned when I started building software for churches is that most major giving companies in the church world artificially inflate processing fees so they can keep a bit of every donation for themselves. So as an example, let's say the cost to process a gift to your church is 2%. So if someone gave you $100, $2 has to be designated to the processing company. Well, a church giving company will go in, make that fee 3% instead of 2%, and then keep that extra 1% for themselves, that extra $1. Now, of course, 1%, it doesn't sound like a lot, but what it essentially means is that you're committed to giving your church giving company $1 out of every $100 your church receives digitally, in perpetuity with no cap, forever. And for churches of all sizes, that adds up quickly with no relief. It's just a permanent cost now. So we wanted to put an end to that, which is why we created Nucleus Giving a couple of years ago. With Nucleus Giving, we don't keep any of the donations your church receives for ourselves. So you might wonder, well, okay, how do you make money then? And like virtually all software products, we charge a flat monthly fee. This pricing model is more than enough to keep us profitable and growing, and it saves most churches thousands of dollars in the first year. Now, I talked about the acceleration of online giving due to the pandemic. Here's one church that uses Nucleus Giving, or a church of 250, and when more of their giving started going online due to the pandemic, they did not lose chunks of it because we weren't keeping any for ourselves, and that ended up saving them around $3,000 in fees. And it's hard for me to overstate just how far-reaching this issue is for churches. To pull back the curtain a bit, in the last couple of years, big investors have been pouring millions of dollars into church giving companies that keep a percentage of each donation for themselves. We call this rev share in the industry. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with receiving investor capital as a business, not my preference, but there's nothing wrong with it, the reason these investors are supporting businesses in the church giving space is because they're earning, on average, more than $1,000 per month per church. And this obviously varies per church based on digital giving volume, but the bottom line for every church is that if you're partnered with a giving company that permanently has their hand in your digital offering basket, taking a percentage of every gift for themselves, that's a financial vulnerability going forward. It's gonna end up costing thousands and thousands of dollars. Maybe really quickly, if you're a bigger church, maybe a bit more slowly, if you're a smaller church, but when there's no ceiling on these costs, because you're giving away a percentage of every gift you receive, you're burdening yourself with unnecessary financial risk. As you can probably see, I am not a fan of this pricing model, so we started Nucleus Giving to solve that. And in the first couple of years of operation, we've already saved churches millions of dollars in fees, because instead of keeping those millions for ourselves, we believe those donations belong to your church. Now, fee structures can be complicated. That's why some giving companies say, hey, you can use our platform for free because they're gonna make so much off you with their fees. So if you want to explore this more, there's a link in the description below. You can also go directly to nucleus.church/giving to read more about how this all works. At the end of the day, understanding fee structures and making an informed decision is really the most important thing, because most churches get into this without truly realizing the cost. And we really value being upfront with our costs, how it all works. We also offer scholarships for smaller churches, so please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. Again, head to nucleus.church/giving to explore more. Thanks as always for your time, attention, and trust. We'll talk soon.